Good afternoon and welcome to CSIS. I'm Conor Savoy, the Deputy Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development here. Our topic today is financing for development. More specifically, what comes next following this summer's conference in Addis Ababa. This is especially timely given that the Sustainable Development Goals were endorsed at the UN General Assembly in September. However one views these as too expansive, just right, maybe not expansive enough, they will require an immense amount of money to accomplish their intention over the next 15 years. One area in particular that is critical to meeting these goals is domestic resource mobilization or taxes and other government revenue. This is an area that has seen enormous growth in recent years. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, domestic resources have grown from $100 billion in the year 2000 to over $500 billion in 2013. These domestic resources are now equal to 10 times all official development assistance in Africa. We often talk about the growing importance of private investment in developing countries, yet it's important to remember that this is not a substitute for foreign assistance or a country's own resources. Investment is vital to growing economies and creating the jobs needed to sustain that growth. Yet ODA and a local government's revenue is equally critical to creating the enabling environment, good governance, and rule of law that investment requires. With that said, I'm pleased to welcome Eric Postel, Associate Administrator of USAID here today, to give us a readout from Addis. Eric previously served as the Assistant Administrator for Africa and is head of the E3 Bureau at AID. Before AID, he had a long career in the private sector and began his career as an officer in the U.S. Navy. After Eric's remarks, he'll join us for a panel discussion with John Oldfield, CEO of WASH Advocates, and John Hurley, Director for International Debt and Development Policy at the Treasury Department. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Connor.
Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope not too many of you are drowned. So it's a great pleasure to be here and talk about this stuff. And as Connor said, and as all of you know, with the SDGs passage, then of course the issue becomes, number one, how do we measure it all? And number two, how do we finance it all? And those were a lot of ambitious goals. And the good news out of the Addis meeting, which preceded it, the Financing for Development meeting, is that the global community affirmed or reaffirmed its commitments that there's three streams that you have to be talking about when you're talking about sustainable development, and some might even argue a fourth, but most prominently ODA, private sector investment, and domestic resources mobilized by the countries themselves. And that fourth, maybe some different views, but about remittances. And they certainly play an important role in the countries. And it was very pleasing and satisfying, I hope for a number of you who've been so involved in the discussions and work on domestic resource mobilization, to see the trend line on that. I remember 4 years ago at the big Busan conference on development, out of a whole week's worth of meetings, there was one session on the last day in the last hour on domestic resource mobilization. Fast forward to what happened in Addis, and we actually had one of our virtual interns look through all of the plenary remarks by all of the speakers, and out of 132 plenary statements, 119 talked about domestic resource mobilization. There weren't even 119 people in that room in Busan 4 years ago, let alone all the people that get involved in each and every speech. So I think people should be pleased, at least in the increase in the discourse on it. Of course, then the real thing is action and so forth. But one of the activities that was taken undertaken by 4 governments, Britain, Germany, Netherlands, and ourselves. And for the US government, it was a mixture of the White House, Treasury, and John's here, Millennium Challenge Corporation, State, and USAID was working with all the folks and then a whole bunch of developing countries to put together and announce what was labeled the Addis Tax Initiative, which is a coalition of the willing. And for the donor side, we pledge to significantly increase our engagement and support of this work in terms of tax policy, tax administration. And then the developing countries pledge to increase their work in these areas and to tackle some of these tough challenges. So it's strictly voluntary, and there are still developing countries that are studying it, and more may join in the weeks and days ahead. And I think the first meeting of everybody is, it's next week, right, David, in Europe. So, so people are moving out on that. And as part of that, the US government, specifically Treasury and USAID, pledged to increase our engagement in that. And our team is reaching out to all of our field offices to talk about how we can best do that and have the dialogues with some of these countries that signed up to the Addis tax initiatives, and also to figure our way through the funding thickets where there's not a lot of discretionary money these days, but we're working on several angles on that so that we can make some progress. And this is something for the benefit of all the sectors, so it's great to have John Oldfield here because he'll be able to bring the lens of the WASH sector, but this is clearly a sector where the gap between what's funded and what's needed is really big. And if we can raise, in addition to more private sector investment, increase in investment by the countries themselves, that will be a big leap forward if we can do that. And the same for schools, hospitals, and so forth. So I just tried to give a few introductory remarks just to tee up the discussion, but that's where we are, and there's a lot of work to be done on all sides, but especially on finance, if the SDGs are to be as successful as the MDGs. So thanks so much for being here and all of your work on these very important topics and your thinking and your creativity, because we need the full team, the A team, working this for the next 15 years. So thank you.
So maybe we can come up on the stage. Thanks, guys. So thanks, Eric. I think that was a really good overview of what you were able to accomplish in Addis, and especially around the tax initiative and the importance of domestic resource mobilization. I think you set the stage nicely, and especially mentioning John Oldfield being here. John, I think I wanted to look to you first and sort of get your sense as a member of the advocacy community, especially someone who's working on an area that can be impacted a lot by the greater domestic resources. How do you see this? Why is this important? How are you approaching this topic of domestic resource mobilization and where it's fitting within the financing for development conversation?
Great. Thank you so much, Connor, and thank you to CSIS for inviting me here. Generally speaking, as I think many of you know, I applaud what I consider to be a long overdue conversation about DRM, about domestic resource mobilization. For me, this conversation is less about development assistance and more about development. And I'm personally pretty excited about the role that domestic resource mobilization could and should play in the development endgame, for lack of a better word. As the leader of WASH Advocates, an advocacy organization, I'm heartened by a couple of things. First of all, developing countries' commitments to solving their own development challenges. And secondly, the increased commitments from donor countries to not solve those challenges, but rather to help them, to facilitate, to support developing countries in their own development solutions. I think that the key activity in the process of rolling out domestic resource mobilization, the key role for advocacy organizations like mine, it can actually be quite simple. It's getting Southern voices heard in the South. It's getting Southern voices heard and acted on by their own governments. And let me get back to that in just a couple of minutes here. But first, if I might, just a couple of quick thoughts on the U.S. government and the potential response or ongoing response of the U.S. government to domestic resource mobilization. First of all, on the Hill, my sense is that this conversation here is awfully well timed. I think this dialogue is well aligned with the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act. I think it's well aligned with the interests of Congress for more leverage in our development assistance. I think it's aligned with the interests of Congress to be more catalytic, more first in with our development assistance rather than directly providing goods and services. And I might be a little bit ahead of the ball here, but I think it's aligned with what I perceive the interests of Congress to be, meaning we should be working more with our partner country governments rather than in spite of or around them. So I see a great deal of potential for DRM on the Hill. My asks, which I have not relayed to Capitol Hill yet, but if I might, would be for Capitol Hill to be permissive, to be flexible, to be responsive, to be supportive of domestic resource mobilization, to be supportive of the Addis tax initiative, this coalition of the willing that Eric mentioned. This isn't just about increasing the tax to GDP ratio in developing countries. It's more about making sure that we get the right mix of public and private finance, of domestic and international finance of all flavors on the table, and then positioned to be spent, to be invested on the right development priorities within those countries. Within the administration, as an advocate, I'm certainly happy with the Addis tax initiative commitments. I'm happy with the whole of U.S. government approach that the administration seems to be taking. This panel is a good example of that, and I'm sure that MCC and many others are in the audience here. I'd ask the administration to continue to be transparent about how you all expect to meet the Addis tax initiative commitment you've made. And I would urge the administration, and this may well already be underway, to pick 2, 3, 4 countries or even subnational geographies, regions, provinces, where the demand for domestic resource mobilization support is clear, where commitments to the sustainable development goals, the global goals, are clear, and where international donor support for DRM can be made available. Pick those 2, 3, 4 countries and pilot DRM work on tax collection, on fair tax policy, and on making sure that those funds are invested wisely. I see other potential to link DRM with open budgeting and open contracting efforts at various levels, national and subnational in developing countries. And I'd certainly encourage the administration to look for ways to partner with other donors in this space. There was a session hosted by the United Arab Emirates at the UN General Assembly Week on mobilizing additional financial support specifically for the SDGs. So there's a lot of latent demand for this dialogue that's happening in this room this afternoon. Just a couple of quick things, if I might, on how civil society, how advocacy groups, how U.S. nonprofits, for example, could and should follow up to Addis and the Addis tax initiative. Just on a personal note, if I want to continue to say, I do this to work myself out of a job, if I want to continue to say that cliche and be taken seriously, I think that domestic resource mobilization is an effort that I absolutely must support. I think the key to success in domestic resource mobilization is paving this two-way street between people and their governments, between strengthening that dialogue between voters and their elected officials, again at national and subnational levels. I direct your attention to paragraph 12 of the Addis Action Agenda, delivering social protection and essential public services for all. And the Action Agenda commits the world to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. We commit to a new social compact. Maybe somebody understands what a new social compact is. I certainly don't at this point. So what I want to do is just drill into one little piece of this puzzle. One challenge to domestic resource mobilization that keeps coming up is taxpayer morale. It's not the ability to pay taxes, it's the willingness to pay taxes. I think that incorporates everything I want to say about civil society and about advocacy in a nutshell. Now, the recipe for high taxpayer morale is actually pretty simple. It's it's fair taxation, it's cracking down on non-compliance, it's being overly transparent on what my taxes and your taxes are being spent on. And now as people control their own governance, as people see the value they get for their taxes, as people see other people, other corporations making similar contributions, you break through this chicken and egg problem where taxes aren't being paid because services aren't being provided, and services aren't being provided because there's no money in the bank or in the Treasury. So once you break through that chicken and egg problem, I see taxpayer morale going up. I don't think there's any controversy about that. The advocacy community here, regardless of WASH, health, education, any other development sector, has a pivotal role to play in paving this two-way street between people and their governments. First of all, we in the advocacy space need to learn or continue to learn about domestic resource mobilization. We need to learn about what's working. We need to learn about its potential. And we need to incorporate DRM both into our advocacy and into our programming, sector-specific and otherwise. I think we in the advocacy community need to urge our partners, we need to urge both donor and developing country governments to support domestic resource mobilization, even if it doesn't directly benefit a particular sector, much less a particular organization, at least during the short to medium term. I think we in the advocacy community need to use domestic resource mobilization to continue to increase our focus on the poor and on the poorest of the poor. I think we in the advocacy community, and this is something that an advocacy guy would say, I think we are not served by being patient. If we don't get a head start, if we don't do very well in the first 5 years of this next 15-year commitment, we will not meet the global goals. We will not meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think we can use DRM, the interest in DRM, to get a good head start on that. Now I see, specific to the WASH sector, I see water and sanitation both as a potential leader, a thought leader in this space. Water is arguably very much in demand. I think conversations about water, even about sanitation, can help pave that two-way street between voters and their governments. I naturally, as you might imagine, I also see the WASH sector, water, sanitation, and hygiene sector, as a potential beneficiary if and when additional funds, both public and private, become available. Now, if I can just, I think many of us in the advocacy space have to be optimistic or naively optimistic, or else we wouldn't be able to do our jobs. So let me dream a little bit more in 30 seconds about this two-way street, this paved two-way street. I think the advocacy community can make paying taxes sexy. But listen, imagine this Bush radio announcements, television announcements around sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Latin, South and Central America. My children will have a better life because they went to a taxpayer-funded school. My community got safe drinking water, so my kids aren't sick because of taxpayer dollars put to work. It's like the signs we see all around DC. They make sure, the government of DC makes sure we know when our taxpayer dollars are at work. You know, I can get my produce to market in 2 hours instead of 2 days because of a publicly funded, because of a taxpayer funded road. So I think we're at the cusp of something enormous here. The SDGs are about 100%. The MDGs were about 50%. The MDGs were about doing something halfway over 15 years. 100% is 100%. We need to be talking about trillions of dollars, not billions of dollars. And my closing comment is, I'm glad to see a packed room here today. Domestic resource mobilization efforts cannot be a labor of love. We have to professionalize efforts to focus on domestic resource mobilization. We need more professionals working on all aspects of it, and I look forward to hearing from you all today on what we can do together, both individually and organizationally. Thank you, Conor.
Thanks, John. That was great. I mean, I think what I heard from you, one of the biggest things is this idea of a social compact, the willingness to pay. You know, these are issues that I think we should explore a little bit more today. But before that, John Hurley from Treasury, can you give us a sense of how the Treasury Department is approaching this issue? And I think maybe one thing to keep in mind too is that it's not just about raising the money. It's also about how you spend the money, and it's about budgeting, and it's about ensuring that the people can see that what John was, to John's point, that the money's being expended for the good of the citizenry, and it's not just going off into some Swiss bank account somewhere.
Right,
So,
and
John.
thank you, Conor, and
Yeah.
thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion today. For those of us at Treasury Department, tax and public financial management is an extremely sexy issue.
There you go. So
That is sexy. So I was right.
It's our lifeblood, so there you go. Let me make the following points with respect to this topic. One, just to pick up on something that Eric mentioned early on, which is the voices of the beneficiary countries, the developing countries on this issue. There was something that was put out prior to Addis. It was called the Common African Position. Some of you may be familiar with it. And it was really the African leaders getting together to decide what the priorities that they wanted to put into Addis and those positions what they wanted to advocate. Domestic resource mobilization was sort of a consistent, strong theme in that Common African Position. And so for us, we wanted to be very supportive of that position going into Addis, and it's one that we've always traditionally maintained as well. Secondly, we have at Treasury, and not many people may be familiar with this, an Office of Technical Assistance, and what they do, it's a very small outfit, roughly $30 million a year, and they provide assistance throughout the world in developing countries on public financial management, largely other areas as well. And so they were very much invested and involved in this. But one of the things that they point out is it's not just sort of on a rhetorical scale that you have to have this demand, is that those who are in the trenches in developing countries have to be vested in this as well. So any reforms in this area there's a lot of vested interests in status quo, and you have to see the leadership and the willingness to take the steps and actions necessary to make progress on domestic resource mobilization, whether it be tax revenue raising measures or expenditure measures, to be able to be successful. And for the OTAs, we call it, they have a number of cases where they said, the officials say, we really want you to come in. They go do some due diligence, and they find out that really when they would not be able to successfully implement a program because there is not in the trenches that willingness. And it really takes from the top down that willingness and demonstrated willingness to be successful. They don't want to go and spend our taxpayers' money on a program that's not going to be successful. Having said that, given the demonstration of interest in this topic, as Eric mentioned, we have committed ourselves to increase our assistance. We're going to be working in terms of our future budget requests from Congress to hopefully double the amount of money that we're going to be applying to this area. And to Conor's point, from us, it's not just tax. And I think one of the things is Addis Tax Initiative, it's a bit of a misnomer because it suggests it's all on the revenue raising side, but it's also on the expenditure side. It's public financial management, which includes, it's both sides of the coin. It's the revenue and the expenditure. To John's point about, you have to have this compact. People are not going to be willing to pay taxes if they don't see anything out of it, some effective use of those resources. And then my final point is, just because I was in the trenches and negotiating this Addis Ababa action agenda and involved in various versions of it. And at one point there was a suggestion to have a specific number, like all developing countries should have at least 20% of GDP for tax through revenue raising to 20% of GDP. And we didn't think that was a good idea. A number of people didn't, because that sort of generalizes it. I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And for some countries, there are cases of countries out there where their current tax take is 40% of GDP, and maybe they should come down. There's others who are much less, and maybe they should go up. So I think you have to look at it in terms of each individual country and what's appropriate and what the political economy can support. But we always have to think of it in terms of, how can we meet these sustainable development goals given our domestic resource base, private investment, and some cases official assistance.
Thanks, John. That's great. One of the things that you mentioned was this idea of dealing with the vested interests that exist. And, I think with a lot of, this is one of those areas that we can easily fall into simply relying upon technocratic reforms and to say this is the tax code you can need and this is how you do it and this is, but it ignores the existing political economy that's there. Eric, so to you, how can we work more with developing countries to tackle those issues? How can we get around them, or how can we just be more aware of them when we're actually trying to design these programs?
So it's a great question, and it's a very important topic, as both Johns illustrated. And there's a lot of analytics to show that if the country's not committed, the assistance doesn't work out so well. So I think each case is different. In some cases, some technical assistance can actually help with those hurdles, whether it's working with parliaments, working with ministries, working with civil society. In some cases, some technical assistance can give people more tools and information to then realize that actually it could be a win-win for all. But in some other cases, it's just not. There was a case in Haiti a few years back where the government started just to enforce the existing rules at the borders. And all of a sudden, there were all these tire burnings going on and demonstrations in Port-au-Prince, a long ways away from the border. And then as soon as the enforcement was, in this case, the government caved, as soon as the enforcement stopped, all of a sudden there were no demonstrations in town. And so, no one's fingerprints could be found, but, people knew what was going on. And so in some cases, donors are going to have to say, we're just not going to play if you don't have that commitment. And MCC has done some projects in DRM as well, and that also is very consistent with the whole MCC model, which is, you've got to show the commitment, and there's other ways. And then in some cases, though, we're going to have to be creative more on almost on civil society and general engagement about talking about how this really can be a win-win. And not everyone, some people see it as a zero-sum thing. And there are some early discussions even here in the United States, when you start talking about this, people say, oh, you're trying to raise how much money goes, the taxes on everybody. And said, well, actually, when 90% of the people are avoiding taxes, simply collecting taxes from, say, most of those people would enable you to lower the rates on the others. So sometimes I think it's going to have to be done through civil discourse and those routes to sort of break the logjam. But in some places, it just flat out isn't going to be possible, and that's fine. But then those, I think it's good in those cases to make sure that the people know that their elected officials will never be able to make good on their campaign promises because the math doesn't work on the provision of water, education, health, or whatever. But then at that point say, look, we're not going to throw our resources down the tubes for someone that's not committed. It's not a simple one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah. I mean, John, do you have a view? Do you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I would just share Eric's view on that, and I think that with respect to some of the cases I've seen out there, I think there is an increased willingness to address this, because I think there's a greater understanding of not just being a technical issue, but rather it gets to the point that John raised about we have to have accountable institutions. Eric raised Haiti, and I think there's been a lot of criticism of Haiti in terms of its being basically run by NGOs in civil society. And part of the reason is because the government really has to, because they have lack of resources. Right. So they have to turn to the NGO community there to do a lot of this. But if we were able to raise more domestic resources and they were held to account by those paying those resources, you could see a much greater contract between, implementation of this compact or contract between those that are the people and the government that serves the people.
One of the things that you mentioned is the idea of civil society using things like that to hold people account. Are we doing enough around that or is this sort of the next step to sort of sustain the momentum that we see on domestic resource mobilization? Is the next step going out to civil society in these countries where there does seem to be a commitment, work with them to hold their governments to account? I mean, is that one way to move this down the road?
So at least for my part, I don't think we're doing everything that we could because especially prior to all this, the resources have been so modest that a lot of the work was done strictly at the technocratic level. But certainly our team can attest that I've been asking them to think about new ways to come at this. It may not always be from the technocratic thing. The reality is this work will be carried forward, I would hope, by the next administration, and I certainly hope they would be factoring that in as well, because it's really important. But more and more people are getting it. I'll never forget on the Health Commission, we went to northern Mozambique, really remote place, and there was a guy who has built a cashew processing business that now has thousands of outgrower farmers, and he basically told the commissioners and myself, he said, I really hope that the government will do more on all these issues of taxation and also transparent, accountable spending, because only at that point will they listen more to me than to you donor folks. Mm-hmm. And the more we get people understanding that and understanding that's the key to safe schools and WASH and everything else, that the more progress we can make on this.
John, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure. Just a quick story. A couple of years ago, Conor, I was out in The Hague at the World Justice Forum, which is put on by the World Justice Project. During the opening plenary, a question came from the audience to the panel. This conference was all about rule of law, all about democracy and governance, all about this two-way street between people and their electeds. The question was, is there a primary school for democracy? Is there a primary school for rule of law, or do I have to go get my JD or my LLM to understand what democracy is all about? And I wasn't terribly surprised, but nobody on the panel had a good answer for that, and nor did I at that point. Thinking about it later, I came to the conclusion that the primary school for the social compact, the primary school for democracy, is the Village Water Committee. It's the Neighborhood HIV Council. It's the Village Education Committee, particularly for women who get their first taste of participatory democracy in that Village Water or Education Committee. That's where that two-way street starts to get paved. That's where there's a stronger and stronger dialogue between people and their governments. Now, the key to success in domestic resource mobilization is going to be laying down another layer of asphalt on that street by letting people know through perhaps slightly technocratic but still very, very important open budgeting and open contracting processes at national and subnational levels across the globe. Here's what we're getting for our taxpayer dollars, or in some cases, here's what you will be getting for your taxpayer dollars. Right now, it's funded by overseas development assistance. Your taxpayer dollars should and could be funding this. Your taxpayer dollars should and could be making your roads better, be making your schools better, be making your water safer, and bringing it more closer to your home. So I think that the international donor community in the next 5 years is well placed and well advised to double down on strengthening civil society organizations in developing countries to make sure that the voices of Africans are heard in Africa, country by country, community by community, that the voices of Latin Americans are heard in Latin America, again, country by country, subnational geography by subnational geography. That's going to break through this taxpayer morale problem.
Just one other element which I don't think comes to the fore a lot is freedom of the press, because in my travels throughout the world, I've seen a number of examples where it's stories in the press which hold officials accountable and ensures that through the transparency that people are held to account for the monies that they're provided and are expected to expend. So I think that's a really important part. It was something that I myself was able to insert into the Addis Ababa action agenda. In one of the many paragraphs, there is reference to freedom of the press, and I think that's a critical component of this enigma, if you will.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think if you look at articles in our own country, you see that people hold their officials to account, and when money is being mismanaged or misspent or whatever it may be, that's one of the first lines. It's often the way we find out about it immediately. Shifting directions a little bit, one of the things we've talked a little bit about are the resources available to support this. And we haven't really talked too much about how much we're spending through the U.S. development budget, but how do we build greater support for this? There's a little bit of reference to funding thickets that exist out there, but how do we work within the existing system of development constraints that exist within the U.S. foreign assistance budget to grow support for this and to actually put some more resources behind it?
So there's a whole bunch of people in this room that have been very important and essential to that effort of raising awareness and talking to a lot of people about this, and I'm very grateful to them. And you see it's starting to get traction. There's some in draft language on the Hill. The Hill is starting to insert things that they encourage this effort, and I think there will be many avenues over the next 15 months to continue this. I mean, we're starting now on these things. One's already happened using existing authorities. As some of you know, resources to pay for the response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic was built into the original legislation. So under that, Secretary Kerry announced an effort around health financing, not strictly DRM, but health financing, and which also includes some of these civil society pieces. And he announced that $65 million over 3 years, so about $20 million a year, would be devoted to this. And Ambassador Birx is committed to trying to make progress on this. And so you see concrete steps. We're working some additional things, and I hope, plea, request the next administration. I think this is, with a few exceptions, I think there's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that are broadly supportive of this. And so I think there's plenty of things to work on going forward. And then also just looking at both the nuts and bolts of this and the concept that this is a global good. If you raise the revenues, and there's plenty of studies to show this, in almost every case, not every case, but almost every case, when the revenues rise, all the social safety net and all the sectors benefit. It doesn't all go into weapons and presidential planes. And so there's lots of evidence to show that everyone benefits. So how do we get away from everything needs to be completely earmarked and therefore can't work on something cross-cutting like this, as opposed to if everybody pitches in a little, we can lift the whole thing for everybody. And so that we're working on that inside the administration and having conversations with people on the Hill, and I think that's another aspect to the whole thing. But I don't know what others would say.
No, I would just add that we believe that the international financial institutions also play a critical role in this objective. The IMF, in particular, through its surveillance programs, has a continuing dialogue with countries in terms of fiscal matters, and this is clearly a priority for them. And I think that with respect to the MDBs, they work with the IMF, and for the IMF and the MDBs, it's not so much as raising tax rates, it's really tax compliance. And that's really, I think, the target of everybody's efforts. Is we're not talking about we need to go from a marginal tax rate of X to Y. We need to, we have to build institutions, effective institutions that comply with current tax laws. And if we can make success and progress on that, I think we'll go a long way in achieving our objectives.
Yeah. John, you had said in your comments that you felt this was a well-timed conversation on the Hill. What makes you say that? And do you think that this is possible, what we've been talking about in terms of building the support?
Right. Well, this packed room is one proxy for the good timing on this, I think. And Eric's
It's the free coffee, though, so.
Right.
Sorry. It's still a new building.
And Eric's comments about 120 out of 130 or so speeches in French and English, and Addis mentioning most of them positively, all of them positively, I think, domestic resource mobilization. I think the timing, it's clear that the timing is good. I personally am in a bit of an awkward spot because most of my time I spend trying to encourage Congress to fund water, sanitation, and hygiene, not all of these other things. And now I'm up here encouraging Congress to be flexible, to relax, to trust the administration to carry out its work in domestic resource mobilization. So, that awkwardness aside, I think it's going to be important for, I hope, everybody in this room to do what we can to allay Congress's fears, particularly some of the concerns that the administration is trying to get ahead of fiscal conservatives. On the one hand, fiscal conservatives don't necessarily want to support something that just increases taxes, or even if you could take the word taxes out of it, we're still talking about public finance here. So fiscal conservatives might not like the idea of raising taxes, but again, they do like the idea of aid independence. And DRM can be awfully bumper stickery. DRM, domestic resource mobilization, is the pathway to aid independence. So I think there's pros and cons on the Hill. They are concerned about taxes. They are concerned about how these funds are being spent. And I hope that the administration doesn't box itself into a corner, making too many guarantees about how these funds, about how much control they have over how these funds will be spent. And if you put $1 million into domestic resource mobilization, we promise that you'll get a guarantee of at least $1 million spent for education or health or WASH or something. We can only be so restrictive there, and I'm encouraging Congress to make a bet. I am a gambling man, and this isn't a very big bet. Yeah. This is a small bet, relatively speaking, but the payoffs are potentially enormous here. I think success in advocacy for domestic resource mobilization in this country is going to parallel successful DRM advocacy in developing countries. It's not just about raising taxes, it's about getting the right mix of public and private financial support, of domestic and international financial support, and all sorts of different mixes on the table, and then get those funds spent on health, on education, on WASH, and so on. I think that those of us in the NGO community and the advocacy community here in Washington can send signals to Congress. I'm certainly happy to do this, and I am doing this. Yes, take a percent of our sector-specific earmark. It's not an earmark, but take a percent of our sector-specific congressional directive and invest it in DRM with no clear payout over the short to medium term for WASH or for education or for health or any specific sector like that. Eric mentions, or USAID mentions, the 20-to-1 return on investments in domestic resource mobilization. I think that the ROI of DRM can be even higher than 20-to-1. I think we need to do everything we can to properly target our domestic resource mobilization support in countries who have made the strongest, most explicit commitments, not just to the Sustainable Development Goals, but to the first 5 years of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's going to be easier to target our DRM support from an administration perspective than, I think it's going to be easier than it could be to choose those countries.
And I'll just add one super fast thing, which is the other side of it, which we're very, very mindful is, I've talked, several of us, we talked about some of the upside of this vis-a-vis specific sectoral things, but we're completely mindful of the fact that we are asking people to say, there will be some child out there who doesn't have a book who might have, because the cost of that book we're putting into DRM. But my view is that, if we've got 100 kids with books, let's go ahead and, and we all have, probably all of us have kids. This is not trivial stuff to mess around with. There will be literally 1 or 2 of those kids who don't have books or have to share. The 98 will still get them, but why would we do that? This is serious stuff. And the reason is for every 100 that have the books, there's easily another 100 that don't have them now. And there's no other answer that I've seen anybody come up with for all the rallies and concerts and everything. There's nobody with a big answer to say, how do those 100 that have gone 20 years without books, how do they get them? So yeah, we're going from maybe 100 to 98 because we're trying to get 200. And time will tell. That's why we're going to do this stuff modestly, like as a pilot. And it's serious stuff. We're playing with lives, but 2 sets of lives here involved. And I think that, if somebody's got a better route, let's go for it. But otherwise, let's do this and see if we can get 150 or 200 in their hands. So.
No, I think that's exactly it. I really think that's the point, and that's the argument that needs to be made. And I think we need to hear it more from people in the community at large, from folks like John Oldfield, from think tanks like ourselves, and I think that's what we're trying to do, is to really underscore the promise and the opportunity that exists and how it really is going to be able to fund the 200 books and not just continue to have ODA, charity, and what have you fund that 100 books out there. I think that's absolutely the argument that needs to be made, and we need to make it as loudly as we can because this is really that important. Before we go to the audience, I think just one last question, and this is just, when you said that in 2011 at Busan there was 1 session on this, and then there were 119 mentions in Addis, it got me thinking, what changed? What do you think, what beyond just sort of people looking at the statistics and seeing the data and seeing how much money has increased, what changed? What moved this conversation along?
You guys want to go first? I can say, but...
Well, I'll say this, and this is based on the negotiations that I was involved in, is that going into the negotiations, we thought that this 0.7 issue was going to be a big issue, and it was going to be a very contentious issue between the G77 and the OECD countries. It wasn't, because I think everybody has recognized that the traditional donors have stepped up over the past 10, 15 years since Monterey in increasing their assistance, but there are limits. And in view of the Sustainable Development Goals and all of the things that we're all trying to achieve, it's not reasonable or not viable to think of official assistance continuing to be the answer. So there's a recognition that domestic resource mobilization, private investment, remittances to a certain degree should be a part of the answer. And if you look at just the math in terms of the domestic resource mobilization that Eric pointed out earlier on, and I know the Center for Global Development has done a lot of work on this and people there, it's just such a large number that it has to be the focus of attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think people did math, and then it's like, whoa, the math doesn't work, and how do we deal with this? Yeah. And then the other thing is coming out of, you could see the evolving thought leadership in terms of going all the way back to the Accra Principles, which is this about country ownership. When you write the checks for the development, you have a lot more say. And I think that realization led to some of the most eloquent speakers on this topic were ministers of finance and heads of state out of developing countries. I think if this had just been a donor conversation, people would have said, oh, donors are trying to get out of their obligations. But donors are not trying to get out of their obligations, and there's more than enough work for us all to be doing. This is about those gaps that keep persisting. So I think that that's what changed in many different quarters.
Yeah.
Well, and here's the math in the wash sector, Eric. Mm-hmm. If some of you are probably familiar with the CAMDESU report from 2003, and so the proviso is this is 12-year-old information right now, but I think it's still a valid point. Of a unit of currency that gets invested in WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene, 70% of that dollar, again, these are global averages, comes from public sector finance in developing countries. 20 cents on that dollar is private sector interests, both indigenous and international. 10 cents on that dollar is the entirety of the international donor community. Bilats, multilats, private philanthropies, corporate philanthropies, Rotary International, you name it. That's 10%. The US part of that 10% is about 10% of the 10%. So at my work at WASH Advocates, on a daily basis, on my best days ever, we influence about 1 cent. Maybe 1.5 cents on that dollar. That's not going to solve this problem. I think I use less diplomatic terms. I think the conversation has grown up. People have done the math. The conversation has grown up. And there's two things here. One is 100%. That's everybody. That's causing a lot of people to grow up real quickly and think about, oh boy, okay, how are we actually going to reach the poorest of the poor? We're done cherry picking. We cherry picked for 15 years. We're done with that. The second is that not only are donors, in my estimation, and I think OECD DAC numbers, OECD Development Assistance Council numbers prove this out, donors aren't trying to get away from their commitments. We could certainly do better. 0.7, anyone, for 45 years. We could certainly do better with our commitments, but we're not trying to get away from those commitments. I think we're trying to be smarter about it. We're looking for leverage, both from an advocacy standpoint, a political will standpoint, and an innovative finance standpoint. So I think donors are looking just to be smarter, and at the very least, how to do better with the same amount of financial and technical and human inputs.
That's great. Thanks, John. And thanks to the panel. I think we'll give the audience an opportunity now to ask some questions. Usual ground rules, there are microphones that will come to you. Please state your name and your affiliation and ask a question, preferably on the shorter side. And let's bundle these. So yeah, can I see a show of hands? Up here, Tony Carroll. There's a mic coming.
Hi, I'm Tony Carroll. I'm a senior associate here at the Africa program. Given that domestic resources tend to have in the last 10 or 15 years flown mightily into education and healthcare, if we change the tax equation in these countries, what credit will be given to those people spending private resources to fund private education, private healthcare, because they're done so with the recognition that the government will never be able to meet the standards that these people now expect in terms of delivery in these areas?
Great, thanks, Tony. Other questions? Yeah, this woman in the back, raising her hand. And then we'll take George over here on the left side.
Thank you. Very good conversation, but I'm surprised that we haven't talked about actual private sector companies in the developing countries, because they often have to deal with the bulk of the need of their employees. Sorry, Carrie Braxton, Global Business Solutions, Inc. We're USAID and World Bank and private sector contractor.
Thank you. Oh, no, George. Yeah, thanks.
George Ingram with Brookings. John Hurley, for you and Eric, your comments about the MDBs sounded like there was the potential of collaboration. And my question is, I know that in the past there have been instances when AID and the World Bank have worked together on particular projects. Is there anything around the tax initiative that there's a strategy or a plan for the bilaterals and the multilaterals to work together in particular countries on tax administration and collection? And the other John, depending on one's perspective, you're either a Don Quixote or a knight in shining armor in the advocacy community. And what are the lessons that you've learned from bringing your alliance on that can be used with other advocacy alliances? Is it the math? Is it country ownership? How did you bring your alliance onto this issue?
Thanks, George. Maybe we can start there, John.
Oh boy.
Oldfield, sorry.
Yikes, thanks.
Or do you want? Or we can go.
Let me buy myself 30 seconds
Sure.
to think here. Colin, thanks.
John and Eric, do you want to talk about the?
Well, I can talk about the
MDBs?
MDBs because they are part of the Addis Tax Initiative dialogue. And the Addis Tax Initiative, one of the things it's doing is looking on sort of a country-by-country basis and seeing, where is their willingness, demand, leadership, and together, I mean, it's a traditional effort by donors is that you have a sort of a country-led process where you have a country group of traditional donors getting together and seeing who can work in with what and what are they already applying and where are the needs and how can various donors fill those needs. So, and I know that our people in the Office of Technical Assistance talk to World Bank colleagues, IMF colleagues on a daily basis in terms of their programs. So I have no concern that there's, in terms of the coordination with the MDBs, that's something that we have to be worried about. I know it will happen.
Eric, do you have anything else?
So on that, I mean, I think there's the DC side of it, and I thought Jim Kim, didn't he also say they would do more in his speech? I thought,
Yeah.
maybe I'm misremembering. And on the country level, George, I think, country teams, the usual donor coordination things, I think people can work on that on the local level with the government at the same time. So I think people can work on it. There will probably still things to be worked out in terms of stovepiping, because, and that's not restricted to MDBs, but you get a lot of people who worked on sectoral programs and they work with sectoral ministries, but the benefits of this accrue to everybody. So I think there's lots of work to be done. I don't think this is something that's 3 years and we're done. I think we're going to have to grind away at this for the whole time of the SDGs and to keep perfecting it. But I think there's some fixings for it. And I'll just, for Tony's point, I mean, I think, private sector financing is some of these social things, as you say, it's been going up like that. And that's one of the 3 streams that people talked about in Addis, which is the whole private sector approach. And I'm sure that's going to continue because, as was mentioned at one point, it's not just about collection, but it's also about delivering services. And so, that's a lot of work that has to be done. And so I'm sure that will continue. And then each country, there may be different dialogues amongst people as to, what are how do the tax policies roll out, and do you give credits to people for funding some of these things on their own or not? And, that's each country's approach. So, and I know we have that question about business.
But did you want to?
Sure, yeah, just quickly, thanks for the question, George. I feel like mostly like Don Quixote up there fighting a battle that cannot be won most days on this, representing a particular issue, a particular sector. But I think I'd question the premise of your question, which I don't think it's just the WASH sector that's interested in this. I mean, I see a lot of stuff post-Addis coming from the health sector, particularly HIV advocates, from the education sector. They're having exactly the same sort of conversations that I'm having with my WASH colleagues. I think the conversations, again, have grown up. I remember 3 or 4 years ago, an organization that's been doing water projects for 30 years, raised a glass of champagne and proposed a toast, and he says, here's to a great past 30 years, and here's to another 30. Which just like, ugh, it just made me cringe. What part of, Agenda Now don't you understand? So that's old school thinking. I think right now the WASH sector in particular is awfully excited about not doing something half-assed in 15 years, not cutting by half the proportion of people living without safe drinking water and sanitation from 2000 to 2015. I think the WASH sector, and I do not speak on behalf of the entire sector certainly, I think the WASH sector is excited about 100% about everybody getting sustainable access to safe drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. And that's forced us to, let's say, sort of decentralize our thinking. One, if I might, one tweet that I saw this morning referenced a group called IRC in the Netherlands, very active in the water and sanitation space. And the tweet was laudatory in that in every single country where IRC is active, their country director is a national of that country. There are no Northern Europeans or Norteamericanos running their programs. It's all Africans, Asians, and Latin Americans. That's sort of decentralizing ownership, decentralizing programming, decentralizing the decision-making about foreign assistance to the level at which the most important decisions about development are being made. And I think that's the exciting part of domestic resources mobilization for me. If 70% of the funding is going to be public sector finance in developing countries, global averages, guess where 70% of the most important decisions are going to be made? They're going to be made at national and subnational levels within those countries, depending on the status of decentralization. And then, of course, everybody talks about Kenya from that point. But I think, I mentioned before, I'm a gambling man, right, George? I think that I could circulate a letter within the WASH community and get signatures on that letter saying, essentially, take that percentage point. we'll have 2 fewer wells over the next 5 years, and we're going to plug that percentage into domestic resource mobilization. I don't know, but I'm willing to make that bet. And I imagine that there's health advocates, HIV advocates, education advocates willing to do the same.
Eric, do you want to take the question on business?
Sure. So I'm not sure if I fully understood the main thrust, but I'll say this from what I did get, that obviously businesses as taxpayers are an important part of what happens when you're working on tax compliance or whatever. It's not a uniform situation, though. Very sophisticated companies, even in faraway places, have all the tools at their disposal to either comply with the things or creatively avoid them, depending on the situation, legally creatively avoid them. Whereas in some other, like smaller companies, have no wherewithal to do that, and it often pushes them into the informal sector, or they have a much higher compliance rate in some cases because they don't have the ability. They're strictly local or whatever. So the way all the current situation plays out on the private sector, I think, is very complicated. But obviously. A lot of, sometimes they are the vested interests, but for others there is actually upside, I would argue. One of my examples is the whole trade initiative, the trade facilitation effort of WTO Bali. Part of what slows down trade is what happens at borders, and part of that is revenue collection. So this is where it's a very nuanced thing, because you might say, yeah, we're going to have a system where there's a little better uniform tax compliance, but we're going to do it in ways that actually move the stuff through the border, and there may be all kinds of upsides in terms of the overall business. So they are a key player in all of these discussions, whether they are taxpayers or tax advisors or lawyers or whatever. They have a lot of engagement in all this, but it's from a lot of different angles. I don't know if that's exactly responsive to what you were asking, but.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's been a lot of work over the past 12 to 18 months on base erosion profit shifting, which affects companies around the world. And this is done through the G20 and the OECD. But I think that despite those good efforts, I think there does need to be a focus on this broader tax base. I think the data will show that, particularly in developing countries, that businesses really are the primary target of tax revenue measures relative to emerging markets or OECD countries, and that, for example, you rarely see taxes on real estate in developing countries. That's an area where you see very few tax measures, and I think that's an area where we're continuing to see progress in trying to apply some of the standards or the measures that are applied in developed countries.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Yeah, this gentleman way in the back on the left-hand side. And then up here, but let's just go here. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tariq Ben Youssef. I'm from the African Union Mission. I would like to thank the panelists for the excellent presentation. My question is about the illicit flow financing from developing countries, which was not mentioned as a source of resource mobilization. The estimate concerning Africa is more than 50 billions of illicit financial outflows, and which is double of official development assistance. Can you link it to tax collection and foreign exchange reserve and its implication on the sustainable development agenda? I know that the US and President Obama are leading this effort at the multilateral arena. Are there other international partners who are also proactive in this undertaking? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark Gallagher over here.
Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Gallagher, and I'm an independent, but I'm working with CSIS on this particular program. And the question I'd like to direct directly to Eric is about sexiness. And how do you get the sexy down to USAID staff? And I want to be very specific here. I've been involved with USAID projects in tax area DRM if you prefer, since 1984. In all that time, I've never been able to get a USAID mission director or even a deputy director to come down for photographs, to allow us to make hay of the fact that we were improving domestic resource mobilization. Not once. They like to go to handing out of rice, opening of schools, but if we want to get the sexy into this, we're going to have our frontline USAID managers buying the sexy and selling the sexy. Is there anything that's within your agenda now to sort of trickle down the sexiness? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. One last question from this gentleman right up here. Oh, just wait for the mic if you don't mind. It's right here.
Stephen Giddings, former USAID. One of the reasons people don't like to pay taxes is, as I think has been mentioned by the panel, and thank you for your presentations, and very, very informative, is that they don't see the results from them at the local level. And part of the reason is that over the past 15, 20 years or so, there's been a big movement toward decentralization from the national governments to the local governments as far as responsibilities for the provision of services, but there hasn't been the fiscal decentralization, hasn't been the money that can flow to make it really work. So the local government gets a bad eye because it doesn't have the resources, yet under some of the mandates they're given by the national governments, they're supposed to provide these services. So I'm wondering if this came up at all in the Addis tax initiative, the whole issue of administrative decentralization versus fiscal decentralization, and how local governments can meet the commitments that are being put on them without the resources that they have. So.
Thank you. Do we want to maybe start from the beginning and address illicit flows? John and Eric, do you want to talk?
Sure,
a little bit about that?
I'll address that. So after President Obama, he hosted a summit with African leaders last year, or this past year, in which there came out of that, one of the things that came out of that was a partnership on illicit finance, as you're nodding your head so you're aware of this. So we are taking that forward, and we are hoping that we can make progress on that particular issue. I would, and we would encourage the same type of efforts, and we continue to raise this both within the G20 and in other fora about the need to address this issue. I will say that I think that some of the estimates coming out, they sometimes include things like just basic flows of capital that not necessarily tied to any illicit behavior. But it is a serious issue, and one that through things like the automatic exchange of information, tax information that's being spearheaded by a number of countries, basically following the U.S. model on this issue. I think we're going to see a lot of progress made in addressing this issue, not only because there's room for progress, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of political interest in addressing this.
So I think John pretty much covered it, but certainly within the Addis tax initiative, the support that donors will provide can be used to deal with some of the illicit finance things. But as John referenced, this term, and it's a very important issue, this illicit finance, but that term is covering a variety of things. In some cases, it is outright illicit finance, illegal, unauthorized, and in some cases undertaken by really bad actors. But it has also been lumped together with totally legal, perhaps in some people's judgment amoral, but totally legal movements of money that has the result of reducing tax bills. That is a different kettle of fish than the absolute outright illegal, often from illegal gain from illegal activities. And we have to be nuanced and careful about this, as John was suggesting, but absolutely, it's an important part of it. It was mentioned by many speakers, and it's in the outcome document from FFD, and the support is available to work on some of those kind of topics if that's what the governments who are partnering on this deem their top priorities in this area.
Do you have anything to add on illicit finance?
No, I have something to say about the sexy comment, though. I'll wait on that.
Oh, all right. Well, then why don't we turn to there's been a lot of sexiness today, I think, or at least a lot of discussion of it. Eric, do you want to address that a little bit in terms of
Do
The
you
country
want,
level, or
John,
do you
you're
wanna go
welcome to
ahead?
start,
No,
and I'll
fire
say
away,
something.
Eric.
Okay, I mean, so I think that there are several parts. First of all, a variety of donors are probably likely to be more paying more attention to it because there are more developing countries, ministers and heads of state that are talking about it and asking for the support. So you have the demand side of the equation that's serving, and you have a lot of people that are try to be responsive to these governments. So I think that's part of it. Obviously, we are trying to, so under Bob Wertz's leadership and working with the interagency, Treasury, and MCC especially, we've been trying to build the case. There's, as you say, Mark, there's a long history of work in this, which has ebbed and flowed. There was a big uptick, obviously, in the breakup of the Soviet Union, for example. So, but trying to put together all the pieces to show people when this works, when it doesn't, and what the upside is. And then obviously we're just trying to bring more attention to it from the Washington side. And what I can say is, as we have started to have briefings with groups of mission directors, we did a call with all the mission directors in Africa a little while ago, and we've said this is voluntary. What we've said to our overseas offices, and it's voluntary for the countries because for the reason we already discussed. If the country doesn't want to do it, it doesn't succeed. So it has to be a coalition of the willing. But we got a lot of interest out of it, and missions that are having dialogues. And just today we had somebody visit from what was Uganda, right? From Uganda, the head of the Economic Growth Office came in and met with us because they were saying we're really interested based on that call, and how do we, we have a lot of questions and talking through that. So I don't know if it's ever going to hit the sexy quotient, but we certainly are trying to build back the attention to it based on some of these basic things that we already talked about, which is the math and the graduation and the unfilled needs. People get that. And there's so many professionals around the world who really want to help all kids read, all kids have good sanitation. So they're looking for things that would help move towards that, would be my answer.
John?
Great. Well, I have some experience trying to make unsexy things sexy, and that part of my work involves advocacy for toilets, for sanitation. Water people get, but how do you make not defecating in the open sexy? That's a challenge. One of the answers to that I think has the potential to inform this dialogue is sanitation arguably remains pre-critical mass. We haven't yet reached that tipping point of political will or financial support for the global sanitation challenge. People like to feel smart. People like to feel that they've gotten a hold of something before the tipping point, pre-critical mass. And smart is sexy. So the smartest people in the world on domestic resource mobilization are in this room right now. 99.9% of the general public thinks it still stands for digital rights management, I think. But we know better. That's appealing, and there's a certain subset of people for whom DRM is going to be a very attractive proposition because it puts them in a thought leadership position, as you're in today, Conor. So thank you, CSIS, for that. People want to feel smart. I think there are more stories, once more people are opening their eyes up to this, I think there are more stories that could be better told. USAID is work in El Salvador being one of those stories. If the El Salvador story, with its return on investment, tremendous return on investment, with those additional tax revenues being spent on health and pension reform, if that story isn't up on stories.usaid.gov, I'm going to make a couple of phone calls this afternoon if it's not. If it is, great, then we need to start directing people to that. I think the administration has other examples of where domestic resource mobilization support has worked, is working. I think there are bets that are continuing to be made. And Steve, to briefly address your question about the local situation, I think every single thing applies locally, but there's going to be different answers to it. I think at the most local level, I would call in, it's not particularly sexy, but open budgeting. Putting the budget, nailing it to a tree. putting it on a chalkboard outside City Hall, and that includes larger, broader sort of ODA-led initiatives like the IATI initiative. When when units of currency are coming into a geography, a political geography, here's what's coming in, here's where we're spending it, and the lower we can get that, the more, I hate to go back to this, but the more levels of asphalt are going to be on that two-way street there.
Yeah. John and Eric, do you have anything to add on the fiscal decentralization with linking with?
No, it's definitely part of the conversation, and I think you're right to address it. And I think it is the political economy of each individual country, so it gets into country dialogues. The Addis tax initiative doesn't have country programs for each country at this point. I think we're working within the current system in terms of looking at a case by case and how can we basically maximize the revenues within the current tax structure. And I think that you're exactly right in terms of how do you, when you're following a process of decentralization politically, you have to have a process of decentralization fiscally as well. I mean, there has to be a marrying of those. And it is something that I think that you're right to bring it up, and it's something that we'll continue to look at.
Yeah, and in some cases the work's underway because, devolution in Indonesia, Kenya, and some of the other places, people are trying to work all the way through that. And money is power, so it's complicated. But, certainly in Kenya, we're very much engaged at both levels of government to try to help them work it out. Funding constraints aren't enabling us to work with every single province, but we're working with more than a dozen of them, plus at the federal level, to help them work that through in different sectors. And it's hugely important for us on some of the existing programs because, we have massive programs in healthcare, as one example in Kenya, and that was all done at the federal level. Now there's a whole bunch of healthcare work that has to happen under devolution at the state, provincial level. So that navigating that and ensuring that the hard-earned gains of the last 5 or 10 years aren't lost in those sectors, that is a real live topic for all the health and democracy, rights, and governance teams working in Kenya now, and for the Kenyans themselves. So it's going to have to be a process of continuous process improvement of working through this, but it's a hot topic. You're absolutely right. It's important to pay attention to.
Thanks, Eric. I think we'll do one last round of questions and then wrap it up. Everyone's been very generous. The gentleman in the back on the right-hand side, and then the one right in front of him.
My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a strategic advisor in private sector and capital markets issues. There's been no discussion of the capital markets, and it seems to me that domestic resources include private capital flows from investors who are probably looking for deal flow, and from the diaspora looking to support projects in country. I don't want to make this a long dissertation, and I'm not going to. However, I'm sure you're all aware that over the course of the past few years, there's been an enormous explosion of issuance, both at the sovereign level and at the corporate level, debt at the sovereign level, debt and equity at the corporate level, that's become unsustainable and is now searching for a bid. I'm wondering, so that's my question, that is the underlying my question. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on what the practical effect is of a collapse in asset values among portfolio managers throughout the world who have been lured to capital markets investing and now are finding that they wish they had searched for yield somewhere else. Thanks.
And then the gentleman right in front of him, right there.
Hello, I'm Paul Canario from the University of Toronto, where the Center for Global Engineering actually does make toilets sexy as part of the Gates Challenge, and at the Munk School of Global Affairs. This is perhaps for John Hurley, but I'd be interested in the other panelists' comments. The World Bank, and I'm a retiree from the World Bank, just to disclose my involvement. The World Bank has had an important catalytic and advisory role and fundraising role, an advocacy role on WASH, for example, on transformative power, Power Africa, but going back to Tarbella, and doing work on public financial management for probably 15 years. Very important work in partnership with USAID and others. Yet, Mr. Hurley, you sort of only on the second round mentioned the World Bank. You know, IMF, fine, and you know, we look forward to the U.S. government contributing to or getting the approval for an increase in the IMF's capital and in a change of its governance. But questions have been raised as well about the U.S. government role in the World Bank, particularly given questions about its capital adequacy and the ongoing difficulties in its management and the U.S. government role. I wonder if all three of you could, and particularly Mr. Hurley, could comment on where you see the World Bank in and perhaps the other MDBs in a very important agenda that you've so well sketched out this afternoon.
Do we have a final question? Anyone? All right, we'll go with these two. So, role of capital markets, local capital markets development, we'll let you wait on that last question. But if anybody has, I think this is an important piece that we've only really started to talk a little bit about.
Right,
I'd be
so
curious to hear.
we've been focusing on domestic resource mobilization, but clearly capital markets are part of the equation as well, and that subject matter is included in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. With respect to the particular issue that you've raised, I would say two things. One is buyer beware. So, I mean, I don't think it's incumbent upon the government to say, to bail anybody out who's made investments in some paper that currently where the price is going in the wrong direction. I mean, these are things that people can buy. There's prospectuses. They should be aware of the downsides to this. Clearly, in high yield markets, there's a lot of risk, and that's why they're high yield. But I will say that within the sort of the overall architecture, there has been, and this was following the debt relief that occurred in late 90s and 2000, there was established a debt sustainability framework. The World Bank and the IMF put this together to try to address this issue. You know, we relieved a lot of debt from developing countries that we didn't want them to once again get into a situation where they're borrowing massive amounts of money that they can't pay back. The macro situation has been pretty favorable until now. We're entering into potentially some rough periods. And so there are certain countries where this is of concern, but I think in general that the situation at this point is not one which would cause a systemic concern, but clearly there are countries that where this is, some African countries where they've gone and borrowed on capital markets and now looking at sort of bullets and how are they going to continue to finance their needs when they have to finance the repayment of these bonds. They're taking on, again, a case-by-case basis in terms of the dialogue with the IMF and with the creditors and whatnot, and there are structures in place to address this if need be, whether that be and that's primarily the Paris Club group of creditors, and so I think that we are sort of managing the situation, but it's one we're watching very carefully. And then on terms of the World Bank, as Eric mentioned, that countries, these are demand, the countries set the priorities. So they'll, as you know, since you worked with the World Bank, there's a dialogue with the country and the country teams and sorting out sort of how the bank can best assist countries in terms of their objectives and given the resource envelope that they're willing to deal with. I think that the World Bank is fully prepared to assist those countries, whether it's domestic resource mobilization. Infrastructure is another area where there's been a lot of attention paid. And again, the social service sector is one that continues to receive attention. There's so much work to be done, and it's a matter of how the outcome of that dialogue between the country officials and the World Bank officials as to how they believe they can best expend those resources. The World Bank does face capital constraints, and it's something that the shareholders look at periodically. I believe that there's going to be another review of this in the coming years, and we'll go from there.
Kurt, do you have anything to add on that, or final thoughts? Or?
So on the first point, I used to be one of the owners of a stockbroker in Zambia and helped create, design, or improve a half dozen stock exchanges around the world in the 90s. And I fully agree that, so domestic resource mobilization gets used It's like an accordion. There's the sort of the more narrow conception of it and the broader one. The broad one absolutely includes all domestic resources as opposed to domestic revenue, domestic resource mobilization. It absolutely encompasses things like the local savings and the local pension funds and things like that. And I've often spoken about this in the context of infrastructure. I was at a panel in Davos in January with Antonio Alamayo was there and Dangote, and everyone was talking about international finance. And I said, well, you know, the most conservative investors out there are the local African pension funds. And they about jumped out of their seats. They were so energized. They fully see that day in, day out in their businesses. And so it's a really important area. For USAID's part, I haven't been encouraging us to do a lot of work in there simply for division of labor. I think that there was a time when USAID did a lot, as did IFC and a bunch of others. But with in the last 10 years, USAID has not been very active, whereas IFC and some others have maintained their activity. So I'm completely supportive of the agenda, but I don't think we have to do everything. And so I think, you know, they are better suited because they've maintained a high level of activity there. I think they have to keep doing that, and that should be part of the conversation with the African governments is, you know, because they say, well, our risks aren't as high as all the international investors say. Okay, well, you guys know that better than anybody, so how do we talk about having your pension funds invest in your country?
John, do you have any closing thoughts? Or
just one quick one. The capital markets question is a very important one, and I won't do a better job of answering your specific question than the other John did here. So let me broaden it just a bit. I think there's an opportunity under the DRM umbrella, broadly defined DRM umbrella, including public sector revenues and the capital markets. I think there's an opportunity for the international donor community, USAID, to continue to play a highly leveraged game there. The Office of the Development Credit Authority at USAID, they've invested, I think that the most recent numbers are 37 million taxpayer dollars, and they've shook loose, I think about 700 million in local capital by essentially de-risking good deals, by making good deals better, by compressing the timelines. That's domestic resources. And that's the international donor community not being last in and drilling a well, but being first in and providing the financial leverage, providing the decoupling it from some of the extant risk there to make a good deal just a little bit better for the capital markets. I could expand, you know, every country, every province needs a small business administration that would likely feed into domestic resource mobilization. Watercredit.org, other microcredit, microfinance, micro-franchise activities aided and abetted by the capital markets are part of the domestic resource mobilization game as well. And many of these give a very specific, concrete, tangible opportunity to whoever in the international donor community wants to pick up that and run with it.
Thanks, John. And I think with that, we'll close. I want to thank the three of you for venturing over here on a rainy, dreary day to talk about what some have characterized as an unsexy topic. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to make it sexy and to continue the good work that Eric and others in the government, John, have pursued. And to do this, I think it's the audience size speaks volumes to the interest in all of this. So thank you for joining us. Thank you all for coming out. Please join me in thanking the panel.